JohnPavlovitz is a writer, pastor, and activist from Wake Forest, North Carolina. A 25-year veteran in the trenches of local church ministry, John is committed to equality, diversity, and justice, both inside and outside faith communities.
Hi friends, Anna Galladay again here at the Convergence Faith Summit. We're really thrilled that you're continuing to join us on this journey, and we hope you've gotten a lot out of some of the conversations that you've been able to listen to. I feel really special and privileged right now because I get to have and hang out. I have a conversation with and hang out with one of my dearest friends, JohnPavlovitz. Many of you will know John for his writings, for the books that he's put into the world, for the public commentary that he makes as a pastor and someone who is really diligent in seeking liberation and an equity of rights for all of us through our political systems nowadays. And I think that it's important that we have this conversation. And John, I'm really glad that you're here to have it with me.
I am so glad to be here, my friend. Looking forward to our time and so glad to be a part of just this really great conversation that's happening.
I love it. Well, I was telling you earlier, and I'll say it again for our listeners, I think a lot of the people that we have featured in this summit are rightfully, what we would call church people, church folk, right. Whether they're denominational leaders or, writers in a predominantly faith-based space. They're people who are still, relatively speaking, embedded in the church, the capital C church. And I think so often when we're talking about spirituality and when we're talking about what this possible shift is from faith to spirituality and or back again, or what that lingering space is in between, having conversations with folks like you and I who really have left the church as leaders and are occasional participants in the church as congregants, yeah. I think has a really important place in this conversation. So I don't know how that resonates with you, but it feels important that we not lose sight of folks like us who once were and now aren't again, and may go, probably won't go back, but might do something for $1,
Right. Yeah. Well, doing the work that I do now, I'm really fortunate because I get to travel and get an accelerated sense of community with people. There's sort of you try to get as quickly as you can an understanding of the space you're stepping into and who the people are and what journey they've been on. And many of those people, for instance, I'll speak at a church and it will be the first time for many that they've stepped into a church building for a long time, maybe if at all. And you get to see this really beautiful, odd congregation that forms when people who are still in that world and people who are outside of it, but yet that sense of a longing for the deeper things is there. That's the commonality. And so it's really interesting to have conversations about what it's going to look like in 10, 20, 40 years.
I love it. I think we'll just start off with the big question, which is, you've talked a lot about life during and through this pandemic, some of which has been health related for you personally, but much of which has been just a commentary on what we're up against and what we have had to deal with. Yeah. How do you think our understanding of faith has been reshaped because of what we've experienced over the last 2 years?
Yeah, I think a lot of it we won't know for a while, but I think one of the things that it's done is it's given us all a chance to downsize the religious apparatus around our spirituality. So many people, they had some of those familiar comforts taken away, and they had to decide, what does community still look like? How much do I need to still call it meaningful spiritual community? And I think churches, individual faith communities have been doing that as well, saying we can't have all the meetings and the gatherings that we used to have. So what does it mean to be connected in a beautiful and life-affirming way? And so I think we've all done what we've done with under these circumstances. We've learned to live with less in some ways. And I think for individuals, it's really expanded their sense of spirituality because they realized that they were connected to so many people through this sort of universal suffering that we were going through. This universal grieving has been a really powerful connecting point, I think.
Yeah, I love that. I love the beauty and the way you state that. I also remain curious around what you think that kind of awakening and what you think that kind of realization will ultimately do to our houses of worship. And I have been saying for more than a year now that church leadership and those of us who are or were pastors really have to rethink what pastoral care looks like, because we used to be people who were on the stage and then in the office or at the bedside.
Right.
We are now people whose stage is very secondary to the work that we're doing. And it's our digital ministers and our video folks who are the heroes in the saga. And I'm curious what you think it means for both individual leaders and for congregations as we try to figure out like what this thing is that we're trying to do.
Yeah, and one of the things, as I travel, and I'll speak in a large gathering, but then I'm usually meeting with church staffs and ministers and caregivers, and they're asking me, what do we do to get people connected to us? But usually it's through the lens of how do we get people physically in this building?
Right. How do we get them to come back?
Yeah, and or show up for the first time. But I think the rethinking is, what does meaningful community actually mean? Does it mean that you're in the pews on a Sunday, or does it mean that someone else's life is impacted in some way by the work that you're doing from wherever you are? And so I think it's really changed the definition of who are our people. How do we form this tribe? And does it matter if people are in a building for an hour on Sunday? Can they still be ours, and can we still be, meaningful in their lives? And so I think all ministers, really, we talk about this kind of courageous faith. I think fearless leadership is going to involve saying, I'm willing to let go of everything that I know to be comfortable and true, and be willing to be surprised by the Spirit of God. And I think that's not something that's easy to do. From being in the trenches, yeah. Sunday is coming and we have to plan this service, and we want something that's easy to wrap our arms around. And this is not going to be that. This is going to be a continual stumbling, I think, for a while.
Do you think that, and I'll kind of focus on our people, Protestant, in many cases, progressive leaders and congregations. Do you think they have the courage and the capacity to do that? Do you think it's possible?
I think what I'm most disheartened by at times is that I think people who are more progressive, they are giving up on the idea of that spiritual community that we have been fighting to redeem or change or alter in some way. And I think so many of them are just exhausted by trying to reconcile their convictions with the community or the larger church. And I think that frustration is leading many of them to check out. And the challenge is going to be, how do we re-energize people in the idea of spiritual community? So it's possible, when I do in this virtual capacity that I do this work sometimes, having this hub for all these people to gather. I don't see those large numbers as affirmation of my writing, but I see it as validation of how many people are still asking all these questions and still frustrated by the things we're frustrated by, and still want a redemptive spiritual community that makes equity happen. And so I know they're out there. The question is, what do they do beyond resonating with someone like me? The words reach them, and then how can I get them into something that's lasting?
So I'm going to ask a question of you that I don't think has been asked to anyone else that's been a part of this conversation, because I know this is a place where you and I both intimately sit. And that is courage around being able to speak hard truths about supremacy culture and about capitalism and racism and queer phobia. I mean, all of the things that even in progressive spaces, people are really hesitant to talk about and name aloud as things that have permeated into our worship spaces.
Yeah.
I mean, I think all of us recognize that there are tentacles of our history that have made the church what it is. And a lot of those tentacles are things that have entangled us in really problematic and toxic ways. Right. And so maybe my follow-up to that first question of, what kind of courage is it going to take for leaders to have courageous faith and be able to look at this in a different way, but then also how do they have the courage to speak to these hard truths around political division and things that really are at the heart of their congregants' minds, but often are taboo topics that no one wants to bring online or from the pulpit because of this, this belief, this odd belief that, politics and religion are not as intertwined as they actually are.
Right. Well, in my case, I was fortunate because where I was, I had built up an equity of trust. I had relational capital. I'd been at a community for a long time, and I could stretch them and nudge them. But when I went to a new community, I didn't have that. And of course, I knew that I was going to be either an authentic pastor or an unemployed pastor at some point. And when I was released from that expectation, when I didn't have to represent anyone else's faith convictions but my own, then I found that voice. Then I found the clarity and the explicit truth that I needed to speak. And I think that's what most people in the local church leadership setting, we don't often realize how politically charged that position is, because you start in a community of people you love, but it's easy to become beholden to those people for the same reasons. And I think we need ministers who do not make their living getting paid by their churches so that they don't feel obligated to speak what that church they think can accept and speak what they feel called to share. And that's a slippery, it's a slippery thing, because you don't want to be intentionally abrasive to your people, but you want them to hear things that they will not hear from other people. I think spiritual community, if it's courageous, has to be the place where we can share the deepest contents of our hearts, and we don't have to edit those things.
And should not the opposite also be true? Should we also encourage, i.e. teach, require our congregants and those that listen to us to really know and understand intimately who Jesus was as a political figure, and that, his work when he was walking the earth was as politically charged, if not radically more politically charged than even folks like you and I, who people think do nothing but talk about politics. Like there's a reciprocity there, and it's incumbent on not just, I think, our leaders to step up and lean in, but also on those who receive those words and receive that kind of guidance to really relearn the Jesus that they feel like they know, so that they can then be a part of the movement that this pastor is encouraging them into.
I always remind people when Jesus calls himself the Good Shepherd, in that what in that title is the idea that, yes, he is pastoral caregiver to those he saw as the harassed and helpless sheep, but not to those he saw as the wolves. To them, he was fierce opposition. And so the complexity of Jesus, that he is caregiver, but he's status quo changer, and he is lover of person and disruptor of systems. And we have to get back to understanding that that is our job as ministers, but also as members of this body. If we choose that, if that's how we identify, there is an expectation of that. And I was at a meeting of a group of people at a church, and I was talking about these issues. It was a progressive church, and one of the women said, "John, we believe in social justice and the compassionate activist heart of Jesus, all this stuff you're talking about." She said, "But we're known as the nice church, and we want to be nice, and we want people to think we're nice." And I said, nice is nice, but you could also be Christ-like. Jesus is fiercely loving, but he is not always nice. And that is something we can be loud and loving at the same time. And so it's retrieving that ferocity for humanity, I would call it.
I love that. I love loud and loving. Yeah, those are good ways to put it. Sometimes I feel like I'm more loud than I am loving on any given day. Yeah, but it is what it is. Yeah. And so as we're looking at the work of courageous faith and really the future of spirituality, what do you think are the biggest theological questions of our time? What is the theological undergirding that is going to actually help us understand where spirituality is going to take us?
Well, I think from where I'm sitting, it's the questions that I ask are always, what is the character of the love that holds this all together, and how do I best emulate that individually and then collectively in community with other people? And for me, that's always come down to empathy, in creating a community that's defined by empathy, and looking for the barriers to that empathy. So what makes me least able to love someone else or even want to understand them? And then what keeps people from loving so many people that I think are overseen and who have been marginalized and oppressed? What is the barrier there? And so there's fear there, and there's grief there, and there's this bad God story. So I think the big theological questions are, how can I take all that away? How can I get to the fear and false stories that people tell themselves? Not so I can change them to align with me, theologically or politically, but how can I take away their fear so that they are unobstructed in their view of the other and of themselves?
Yeah, empathy is one of those characteristics that I think we so often throw around like niceness. And yet we don't really understand the radicalness of true empathetic heart. There is an uncommonness to a true empath. Those humans are not they don't simply care. They care, and their body and their hearts are changed through that caring. And we have this, I don't know, I feel like we miss the embodied awareness part of the empathy, because we think that our heads can care and our hearts can care, but our body doesn't have to get involved in it.
Right.
And so where does the rubber meet the road? And real empathy puts us in the middle of the work.
Yeah. Exactly. I've talked about compassion being tied to the word bowels, the original word compassion. And there was this phrase, twisted in your bowels. And I always ask people, what is it that twists you as you look at the world, as you look at the crowds the way Jesus did, and then follow that burden and to its logical conclusion, which is you are placed and positioned and required to do something about that burden. And so I think the greatest battle right now for people who are still trying to hold on to spirituality in community is realizing how many people have had a faith that is devoid of empathy, without a desire to care that deeply. I think I see that in Jesus, when he says that he saw them as harassed and helpless. He was looking at what the world was doing to them, not what they were doing, not their conduct and not their immorality. He was looking at their internal condition, and that was what fueled his ministry. And that compassion, that has to be the genesis of our work. It has to be the why that we exist here.
I wholeheartedly agree. I think that there's a misstep in how we have. I mean, I feel like my grandma when I say this, how we've raised up Christians, over the generations, because we really have siloed so much of the learning and so much of the experience of faith based on, our denominational limitations and what we expect the polity to allow us to do. Just going to let it happen. And we, and because of that, we have a lot of folks who are, anywhere from our generation and older, who have never had to understand the empathetic side of faith. They understand the missional side of faith, and they understand the caregiving side of faith, but they don't understand the empathetic side. And it's a very different level of commitment to other, when you peel that all away.
Yeah, I think that we've forgotten that this journey of spirituality, it's costly, that there is a price tag there isn't a subtraction that comes when we give of ourselves to someone else. When we do care that deeply, it's a spending of ourselves on behalf of other people. And you do, as you mentioned earlier, that does bring you into the trenches of the really messy lives of other people. You cannot have a clean, detached spirituality. That would be an artificial experience of religion.
Right. So let's talk about artificial. We'll move from that point and talk about where we are with our younger generations, because I think that word artificial is what many of them would use. Inauthentic, artificial, crafted, kind of that many churches have a recipe of sorts for how community is done. And it's created a radical turnoff and a radical distaste for most of the young folks that I know. And when I say that, I'm talking like 30 somethings and under, even some of in their 40s like us. But it's, where does spirituality appear in those spaces, and how do we as faith leaders or as like the pastors that are watching these conversations, how do we draw a line or connect the dots from the kind of spirituality that is a part of the lives of these young people, but is not a part of the church?
Yeah, that's a massive question. I still talk to a lot of teenagers and college age students, and there is, if you combine the political and the high profile of a certain group of Christians, which already gives them a skewed understanding of the breadth of spirituality, even within the Christian tradition, but then there is a skepticism that's there. And I think that, combined with the fact that they have these phones and they can get anywhere, and so they can find things that are meaningful, they can find stories that move them, they can connect to other people and to art and music and all these things. So the question that I'm always asking is, what do I have to offer them that they're not already getting? And so right now, I think young people, where we're going to reach them is in authentic relationships that transcend the church building and the church structure. And I think that's what people are starving for, because there's sort of an epidemic of loneliness. I find in young people, they have a lot of interactions, but not real deep connections. Yeah. And that has to be something that we do. And again, that's that you have to invest so much time. As a student pastor, that was something that I was there in the lives of young people. And yet my senior pastor, he would get up on a stage and he would speak to a group and then he would leave. So he never had, or he or she never had that intimate awareness of other people's lives unless they were coming for counseling. And so I think our only theology that matters is relational. And it's the only thing that's going to matter to other people. They don't care what we believe. They don't care how cool the music is. They want to be known. And that's what we need to do.
I'm curious. I've been thinking a lot about, and I talked a little bit with Trip Fuller about this on one of the other conversations. I've been thinking a lot about this understanding of third space. And so like for many of us, and even young people, like they have two spaces where they spend the majority of their lives. It could be home and school. It could be home and university. It could be home and work. For a lot of years, that third space for many, many, many people was church. Yeah. That's not the case anymore. And so like, I think about my third space now in the life that I have, in 2022, my third space is at this urban dog park down the street where, my partner and I take our dog almost every day of the week. And we meet up with all these other humans who are also getting fresh air and taking their dog. And we've all become, it's a family. We are a group of humans who support each other in community and have become as tight a community as I ever had when I was in a church setting. In fact, I've got a host of 20 somethings who, live in the city and bring their dogs and like pull me aside and ask me questions about faith and life and big questions, like the questions of our time that, they have likely never had a pastor in their proximity that gives them that kind of space to ask things that they might want to know. I have other friends who like their third space and that community is their CrossFit box.
That's right.
Or is, their book club or their, the bar that they hang out at. And so I don't know. I'm curious what you think about that. Is there a way by which this understanding of third space might inform for churches a new way of community outside the walls of what they're doing? And if so, like how can we pull that off and have the guts to do it, so that there is an authentic relationality that spawns out of it?
Yeah, I'm smiling because I'm thinking back to a time I was with a group of teenagers and we were going to a corn maze, and we were gotten through the corn maze. I don't know if you ever heard me talk about this, but I got to the center of the corn maze and there's a guy with a TV and a VCR and all these chairs, and he sat my students down and he showed them this evangelistic movie about, kids dying before they accepted Jesus. And it was a kind of an altar call, and it was like, I'm in an evangelistic corn maze. And I think what you're talking about is it's really the danger is that we take that purity of the gym or the dog park and we say, how can we turn that into a church in a way where and so your agenda becomes the same, and it's just you're kind of baiting and switching. So rather, I think we should create communities where we teach people your job is to embody your faith in the places where you exist, period. It's not to bring them to this building. It's not to convert them. It's to share story with them and let your moral convictions come to bear in those places. And that's enough. The people have asked me for almost a decade, why haven't started a church? It's because there's a purity that's really easy to lose, because what you talked about at the dog park, that was an organic relationship that was not bound by any other reason to exist than love for those people.
Yeah, I think, you and I both, when are we going to start a church? I can't, I can't. There's too much to be ruined through it.
And that's the thing, I think you and I would say that to people who are watching this and who are part of those systems and who have strong ties to their communities, their denominations, their traditions, I don't belittle those things, but I do see the way that they limit whatever we believe that the Holy Spirit is, or the Spirit of God, or this bigger love. It cannot be contained if it is worthy of those titles. And so when we find that we're in the dog park, we need human beings and a love for them, and that's really all we need.
Right.
And
Spirit is many times as present, if not more present there, than in a place where, polity and ritual take the place of the way that Spirit moves and breathes through us.
Yeah. And my third space is, I serve in the community through an organization here in Raleigh called Activate Good, and it's just a volunteer hub. And I'll sign up for just a random, work project that I've never been a part of. And when I show up there and I'm with strangers and we're sharing our stories, but we're engaging with the world and we're doing something that matters to us, there's something that happens there that couldn't have been planned, and it wasn't part of a message that I was going to give on a Sunday or the music was going to crescendo into. And that's what I love. I love just being surprised by that presence, whatever it is.
I love that. I think that might be a very beautiful benediction, last word of the surprise of whatever's going to take place. That might be what courageous spirituality and courageous faith actually looks like, is allowing ourselves to have a point of possibility for something that is bigger and greater than we can imagine. Any last words for our friends who are experiencing and looking for the future of spirituality and what courageous faith looks like on this journey?
I always talk to children in our community, and I tell them, today is a day we've never been to. None of us know what this day is going to look or feel like, or what's going to happen. And I think when we talk about courageous faith, these are days that we haven't seen yet. And it's just our job to show up as the best of ourselves and learn what we can and get up the next day and do it. And it's going to be messy and fraught with disappointment and discouragement, but expectancy should guide the way we live.
I love it. Thanks for joining us, John. We're really, I'm happy that I got to spend these minutes with you. And I know that those that are watching value your voice, and we're really happy that you said yes to being a part of these conversations.
Honored to be here, my friend. Thank you.
Thanks.